The first voice you hear every morning has more influence over your life than most of the conversations you will have all day. Before the world places a single demand on you, before anyone asks for your attention or your energy, there is already a dialogue taking place. That dialogue quietly sets the tone for everything that follows. Most people underestimate how powerful that inner voice is because it doesn't shout, it whispers. And because it whispers, it feels familiar, almost invisible. Yet familiarity does not equal truth, and repetition does not equal accuracy. What you tell yourself first becomes the lens through which you interpret the rest of the day. If that first voice is rushed, anxious, or self-critical, it conditions your nervous system to operate from defense. You wake up bracing for impact instead of preparing for progress. Small obstacles feel heavier, conversations feel more threatening, and opportunities pass unnoticed because your mind is already focused on survival. On the other hand, when the first voice is calm, intentional, and affirming, your entire physiology responds differently. Your breathing deepens, your posture shifts. Your mind begins to search for solutions instead of excuses. The day hasn't changed, but the way you show up to it has. The human brain is designed to act in alignment with expectation. When you expect difficulty, you unconsciously gather evidence to support it. When you expect growth, your awareness expands. That expectation is often formed in the opening moments of the day, long before logic or planning gets involved. Many people wake up rehearsing yesterday's failures as if repetition will somehow produce redemption. Instead of learning, they relive. Instead of adjusting, they judge. This pattern drains emotional energy before any productive effort begins. That first internal conversation becomes a script. And once a script is written, behavior tends to follow it. Words quietly turn into decisions, decisions turn into habits, and habits turn into outcomes. This is how seemingly small thoughts accumulate into massive life patterns. Morning self-talk is especially powerful because the mind is most suggestible during transitions. Waking up is a doorway between rest and action, between imagination and execution. What you place in that doorway determines what gets carried into the day. If the first voice says you are behind, you will rush. If it says you are incapable, you will hesitate. If it says you are learning, you will experiment. The difference between stress and strategy often lies in that single internal statement. People who perform at high levels are not immune to fear or doubt. They simply manage the narrative before it manages them. They choose words that create stability rather than panic, direction rather than confusion. The first voice also influences how you interpret other voices. When you are internally grounded, criticism becomes information instead of identity. When you are internally unstable, even neutral feedback can feel like rejection. This is why two people can experience the same day and walk away with completely different interpretations. Their mornings prepared them differently. Their inner dialogue shaped their emotional resilience. Changing external circumstances without addressing the internal script leads to short-term relief, not long-term transformation. The environment may shift, but the mindset remains the same, recreating familiar outcomes in new settings. The most effective form of preparation is not a to-do list, but a decision about how you will speak to yourself. Words don't just describe reality, they direct attention. Attention dictates action. When you consciously choose the tone of your first thoughts, you reclaim authorship over your day. You stop waking up reactive and start waking up intentional. The day no longer drags you forward, you step into it with purpose. This single practice, repeated consistently, reshapes confidence, emotional control, and personal leadership, not through force, but through alignment. Not through pressure, but through presence. Being kind to yourself is often misunderstood as indulgence, as if compassion automatically leads to complacency. That misunderstanding causes many people to reject self-kindness altogether, believing that harshness is the price of success. In reality, the opposite is true. Strategic kindness strengthens discipline instead of replacing it. High performance is not built on self-abuse, it is built on sustainability. No system can function at its best when it is constantly under attack from within. When self-talk is aggressive, energy is wasted on internal conflict rather than directed toward meaningful action. Self-kindness allows clarity to replace chaos. When the mind is not busy defending itself from criticism, it can focus on solving problems. Calm thinking produces better decisions than emotional pressure ever could. Many people push themselves using fear as fuel. Fear can create movement, but it cannot create alignment. Over time, it leads to burnout, avoidance, or inconsistency because the mind begins to associate progress with pain. Kindness creates psychological safety, and psychological safety is what allows growth. You cannot stretch, learn, or innovate while constantly bracing for internal punishment. When mistakes are met with understanding, learning accelerates. Strategic self-kindness does not remove standards, it reinforces them. It allows you to evaluate performance objectively rather than emotionally. Instead of asking, what's wrong with me? You begin to ask, what can I improve? This shift changes how effort feels. Work becomes intentional instead of frantic. Discipline becomes focused instead of forceful. You start operating from direction rather than desperation. When you treat yourself with respect, you create internal order. That order translates into better time management, clearer priorities, and stronger follow-through. Self-respect internally often precedes respect externally. Harsh self-talk narrows perception. Kind self-talk expands it. Expansion leads to better strategy because you're able to see options instead of obstacles. Strategy always outperforms stress. People often believe that pressure sharpens them, but unmanaged pressure fractures consistency. Kindness stabilizes the emotional system, so pressure can be applied deliberately, not destructively. Leadership begins internally. If you cannot guide your own emotions with wisdom, they will guide you with impulse. Self-kindness becomes the governing principle that keeps decision-making grounded. This approach also builds resilience. When setbacks happen, you recover faster because you are not adding self-inflicted damage to the situation. Recovery speed often matters more than avoiding failure. Kindness to self reframes effort as investment rather than punishment. You begin to see hard work as something done for yourself, not to yourself. That distinction changes motivation at a fundamental level. From this perspective, rest becomes strategic instead of guilty. Preparation becomes intentional instead of rushed. Progress becomes measurable instead of emotional. Operating this way compounds over time. Each day builds on the last without unnecessary internal resistance, allowing momentum to form naturally rather than being forced artificially. Words are not neutral. They carry direction, weight, and instruction. Every phrase you repeat internally sends a signal to the part of you that decides what is possible and what is not. Identity listens closely, not to intentions, but to language. You do not become what you wish for. You become what you repeatedly affirm, consciously or unconsciously. The mind organizes behavior around the labels it accepts. When a label is embraced, actions naturally rise to meet it. If you speak to yourself as if you are incapable, identity adjusts downward. Effort shrinks. Risk feels dangerous. Opportunity feels undeserved. The words do not feel dramatic, but their impact is decisive. Identity forms through evidence, and language often becomes the first piece of that evidence. When you say, "I always struggle," the mind looks for patterns that confirm the statement. Confirmation strengthens belief, and belief solidifies identity. Language also determines how you interpret challenges. When difficulty is framed as proof of inadequacy, identity contracts. When difficulty is framed as training, identity expands. The situation stays the same, the internal meaning changes. What you call yourself in private is far more influential than what others call you in public. External praise has limited power if the internal narrative contradicts it. Internal language either permits or resists growth. Identity seeks consistency. Once a self-description is established, the mind works to maintain alignment with it. This is why change feels uncomfortable. It threatens the existing story. Intentional language interrupts automatic identity loops. By choosing words aligned with growth, you begin introducing new evidence to the system. The mind slowly recalibrates what it believes you can handle. This process requires patience because identity does not change instantly. It changes through accumulation. Each aligned statement adds weight, creating a new center of gravity. Over time, When language supports expansion, effort feels more natural. You stop forcing behaviors that contradict how you see yourself. Action begins to flow from belief rather than resistance. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You act in alignment with who you think you are. Identity governs ambition, persistence, and emotional endurance. This is why people sabotage opportunities that conflict with their self-image. The discomfort isn't with success itself, but with the contradiction it creates internally. Words serve as permission slips. They quietly authorize you to attempt, to learn, to persist. Without that permission, potential remains dormant. Every time you speak growth-oriented language, you create internal alignment between thought and action. Alignment reduces friction. Reduced friction increases momentum. Over time, identity becomes less about past evidence and more about chosen direction. The language you adopt today becomes the personality you live out tomorrow. Many people believe that pressure is the primary ingredient for improvement. They have been taught that without constant urgency and self-criticism, nothing will change. This belief keeps them locked in a cycle of force rather than flow. Pressure creates movement, but it rarely creates mastery. Under pressure, the mind narrows its focus to immediate relief instead of long-term progress. Actions become reactive instead of intentional. When growth is driven by punishment, learning becomes emotional instead of strategic. Mistakes feel personal, and fear replaces curiosity. Over time, the desire to improve is overshadowed by the desire to avoid failure. Permission changes the emotional context of growth. It allows the mind to explore without threat. When learning is safe, adaptability increases naturally. Permission does not remove accountability, it reframes it. Instead of asking why something went wrong, the focus shifts to how it can be improved. This keeps attention on the process rather than the ego. People often confuse gentleness with passivity. In reality, permission creates movement by removing internal resistance. Resistance slows progress more than lack of effort ever could. Growth requires experimentation, and experimentation requires room for error. Without permission to fail, experimentation stops. Without experimentation, improvement becomes impossible. Pressure ties identity to outcomes. Permission ties identity to effort and learning. One limits emotional capacity, the other expands it. When pressure dominates, energy leaks through stress and overthinking. When permission leads, energy is directed toward observation, adjustment, and refinement. Permission creates emotional resilience. Setbacks are processed faster because they are not interpreted as verdicts on self-worth. Recovery becomes efficient rather than exhausting. This approach increases consistency. People are more likely to return to tasks when they are not emotionally punishing. Progress favors return behavior more than intensity. By giving yourself permission to grow, you remove the invisible ceiling created by fear. Fear shrinks ambition not because ability is lacking, but because emotional safety is missing. Learning accelerates when the mind is not busy defending itself. Insight arises more easily in environments of acceptance than in environments of judgment. Pressure demands results now. Permission invests in capability that compounds over time. One seeks short-term control, the other builds long-term capacity. When permission replaces pressure, growth becomes sustainable rather than volatile, strategic rather than emotional. Confidence is often treated as a personality trait, something you are either born with or without. In reality, confidence is seed, unstructured. It is built slowly through repeated evidence that you can follow through on what you attempt. Kindness toward yourself is what allows that evidence to accumulate. When effort is met with understanding instead of ridicule, you're more likely to try again. Repetition is the foundation of skill, and skill is the foundation of confidence. Consistency thrives in environments that feel safe. If every mistake results in self-criticism, the mind looks for ways to avoid engagement altogether. Kindness removes that avoidance. When you show up regularly, even imperfectly, competence grows. Small improvements compound into reliable ability. Over time, that reliability becomes self-trust. Self-trust is not built through motivation, but through experience. Each kept promise, no matter how minor, reinforces the belief that you are capable of progress. Kindness supports this process by reframing mistakes as data. Instead of collapsing emotionally, you extract information. Learning replaces judgment. As competence increases, effort becomes less draining. Tasks that once felt overwhelming become manageable. This shift creates momentum without force. Confidence formed this way is quiet and grounded. It does not rely on external validation because it is anchored in lived experience. You know what you can handle because you have handled it before. People who lack confidence often lack evidence, not potential. Their history is filled with interrupted attempts rather than completed cycles. Kindness allows cycles to finish. Consistency also sharpens focus. When emotional volatility decreases, attention improves. Improved attention accelerates learning. With growing competence comes a different relationship with challenge. Challenges are approached as opportunities to refine skill rather than threats to identity. This perspective changes behavior under pressure. Instead of panic, there is assessment. Instead of retreat, there is adjustment. Kindness sustains the long game. It keeps you engaged long enough for results to become visible. Most breakthroughs are delayed, not denied. As capability becomes familiar, fear loses influence. You stop questioning whether you can act and start refining how you act. This cycle reinforces itself. Kindness fuels consistency, consistency builds competence, and competence stabilizes confidence. The direction of a life is rarely changed by dramatic events. It is altered by repeated decisions made in ordinary moments. The morning is one of those moments where direction is quietly set long before results are visible. Morning intentionality is not about rigid routines or perfect discipline. It is about conscious orientation. Before demands arrive, you choose how you will relate to yourself, your thoughts, and the day ahead. When mornings are unintentional, the mind defaults to habit. Habit often pulls from fear, urgency, or past disappointment. This default setting subtly shapes emotional tone and behavior. Intentional mornings interrupt that automation. By choosing your focus early, you reduce reactivity later. You begin the day acting instead of responding. The brain seeks efficiency, not excellence. It repeats what is familiar unless directed otherwise. Morning intention provides that direction at the point of least resistance. A small act of clarity in the morning can prevent hours of distraction later. When priorities are set internally first, external noise loses its authority. Intentional mornings strengthen decision-making. When your identity and values are reinforced early, choices throughout the day require less emotional energy. This practice also builds self-leadership. You demonstrate to yourself that you can guide your attention. That demonstration increases internal trust. When mornings are chaotic, the day feels fragmented. When mornings are centered, the day feels cohesive. Cohesion enhances follow-through. Intentionality reduces overwhelm by narrowing focus. You are less likely to chase every demand when you have already chosen direction. This daily alignment compounds. One centered morning influences the next, creating rhythm. Rhythm creates stability. Over time, the consistent choice to begin with clarity shapes confidence. You start to expect productivity instead of stress. Destiny is not formed by grand intentions, but by repeated alignments. Each morning either reinforces an old trajectory or introduces a new one. Most people try to change outcomes without adjusting beginnings. Intentional mornings address the root, not just the symptoms. When you choose direction before distraction, you quietly steer your life where attention consistently goes.